There's a variety of different reasons that are pushing the oyster farmers further and further away. It's not like they're getting pushed out for good reasons. It's the development, it's the water quality, it's these conflicting uses. And it's really a shame that the oyster farmers are the ones basically that are taking the brunt of it and getting shoved aside.
Welcome to OYSTER-ology, a podcast about oysters, aquaculture, and everything from spat to shuck. I'm your host and the food walker, Kevin Cox. Today we're getting into the nuts and bolts of how oysters actually get grown and why that matters for taste, texture, and the future of coastal communities. My guest is Erik Schlagenhauf, Vice President of SEAPA North America, where he helps oyster farmers adopt innovative gear systems that improve efficiency, sustainability, and product quality. He joins me today to speak globally on aquaculture innovation, offshore expansion, and the future of oyster farming. Erik also explains how small design choices like baskets with true doors and clip systems can eliminate thousands of low-value moves and mountains of zip ties. He also widens the lens and talks about why shoreline politics and water quality conflicts are pushing farmers further offshore. We explore Japan's post-tsunami pivot and why most of Portugal's oysters head straight to France. And we look to the future, to tech and tools that can help farmers plan crops with probabilities instead of hunches and improve traceability and food safety. So grab a grow-out bag and step into the tides as we explore oyster growing methods, improving efficiency by design, the NIMBY factor, copycats, costs, and the ethics of supporting original R&D, and sensors, drones, and AI oyster farming with fisherman, oyster farmer, and SEAPA solutions specialist Erik Schlagenhauf. Erik, it's so great to have you as my guest on OYSTER-ology today. I've really been excited to talk to you and learn about both what you do at SEAPA, but also what you've done before that and how you got into this whole oyster business. So welcome to OYSTER-ology. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to meet you as well.
So before I get into what you're doing now, I noticed that you're also a stonemason and sculptor. Is that right?
Yeah, I dabble. Not professional anymore, but yeah.
I would say you do a little more than dabble. I saw a stone oyster sculpture. I think it was called the Kumamoto that you made. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, I carved a Kumamoto oyster shell out of marble found in Colorado. And it's probably, I don't know, maybe approaching 2-foot diameter, kind of all the way around.
Well, it's unbelievable. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes so if anybody wants to see it, because it is absolutely gorgeous. And I just wanted to find out what the story is on that. But you're not doing that anymore, at least not professionally, right?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'd actually love to see that image as well. I've lost all my photos of it, and I was lucky enough to be able to sell that piece to a very dear friend, so I can go and visit it every now and again. But yeah, I'd love to see the images.
It's fabulous. But I want to hear a bit about your background and how you got into the oyster world.
Sure. Well, I guess to begin with, it was never part of the plan. It just kind of happened, as life does often. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. After high school, I went up to Alaska, ended up becoming a commercial fisherman for a little bit. Got done with that, kind of bounced around the West Coast, and ended up working as a stonemason with my older brother in a little coastal town in California, about an hour north of San Francisco. And I was working with my brother, and things were going pretty well, but I realized that I needed to do my own thing. I love my brother too much to be his employee. So I had to leave, but I didn't actually, I didn't want to become my brother's competition in this small little town. So I didn't know what was next. And one day I'm over at a friend's house and we're having a glass of wine, and another mutual acquaintance comes over and we're talking, and she works with Hog Island. And she's like, Erik, have you ever thought about, working with oysters? Hog Island is looking for a new farm manager for their oyster farm. You should go and talk to them. I was like, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you. I'll go and check it out. So I get in touch with Hog Island. I go up to Marshall. I meet with John Finger, the one of the co-founders and CEOs of Hog Island. Have a really great conversation with him. Just was really impressed with John, and yeah, really a neat operation. But I remember I was freshly married, and I came back and I was talking to my wife about how the interview went. I was like, wow, John's a really neat guy. The company seems really neat, but boy, John looked tired. I was like, I don't know if this might be more than I can handle or want to take on.
Right.
And so I think I emailed John or called him, I can't remember, and said, thank you so much for your time, but I'm going to bow out. And my friend comes back to me a couple days later. She sees me in town. She's like, Eric, what the hell are you doing? Why would you turn that job down? Or, why take yourself out of the running? They were ready to hire you. What else? Do you have something else going on that I don't know about? I'm like, well, no, not really, actually. So I kind of slapped myself a little bit and got back on the phone with John and said, hey, look, if the position's still open, if you're willing to give it a shot, I'm willing to give this a shot. Let's give it 30 days. And then I ended up being there just about 15 years, I think.
30 days to 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
What did you do at Hog Island for those 15 or so years?
Yeah, so I was hired on as the farm manager for Tamales Bay. And, at that point, look, I'd eaten oysters a few times with my mom. I did have, like I said, some marine experience, but I didn't know anything about oysters or the biology. And yeah, so started learning the ropes from the crew that John had in place, from John, his partner Terry. Just really started learning about oysters and being a slave to the tides.
Right.
And boy, thinking back on it now, I lucked out that it was Hog Island. I mean, they're a great company. They have a great reputation that's well deserved. Yeah, so I started learning about oysters and farming and boats and navigation and different growing methods and knots and you name it.
Now, did Hog Island show you the different kinds of growing methods that one can employ in U.S. oyster farming?
Absolutely. A lot of different methods. And just step back for a second. You brought up my stone carving and masonry background. So one of the things that I realized with oyster farming pretty quickly that really this was about material handling. It was oysters, kind of like stone. I had a big pile of oysters or a big collection of oysters in one place of the bay. I had to grab them from that place, move them, process them, and then get them going somewhere else and not break my back or not break the equipment doing it. So I was like, this is like stone. This is like moving a bunch of stone, like doing a chimney or a fireplace or a wall. So very similar. And that's kind of how I approached it. The difference with oysters was a little bit of the biology and the tides. But back to the growing methods, I think Hog maybe has like 5 different growing methods in
Really?
Tamales Bay. So everything in Tamales Bay is in gear. So you can't have any oysters just kind of spread out on the beach like you might find in other places, like up in the Pacific Northwest.
So there's no dredging or anything like that?
No. There may have been way, way back in the day, but not for a long time. Yeah, you have European green crabs and you also have bat rays, a couple predators. So the bat rays are really what the gear is for to protect the oysters from. Yeah, so we had bag on bottom. John had developed his version of rack and bag, kind of the modified French trellis system. We had some subtidal culture. We had trays basically hanging from a floating line that were subtidal always in the water. We had stanways, which was an Australian method of raising seed. They're these plastic mesh cylinders with flotation in the ends. And then at some point, we started to develop what I call tipping bags, which was basically those Fexar mesh bags hanging from a line that about waist or chest height with a float attached at one end so that they would rise and fall with the tides.
I want to make sure that I am clear on the fundamental terminology. That is bottom and off bottom. So one of the things that you see here a lot, some places they call them condos, some places they call them hotels, but basically they're cages that you slide Vexar bags or something into, and they keep them a little bit off the bottom, a couple of inches maybe, and they just sit there. Is that considered bottom gear or is that considered off bottom gear? It's not floating.
Boy, it probably depends on the state you're in. But the thing about those condos, the bag is being elevated a little bit off bottom. You are able to get water flow all around.
It's interesting to differentiate between that and things that are actually floating at some level within or on top of the water column, which is where you focus most of your efforts. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's bottom, there's off bottom, and then there's floating. So I think off bottom isn't necessarily floating. I think the
Right.
French rack and bag method, that's not bottom culture, but it's not floating.
Right.
Yeah.
So you were at Hog, and what took you from Hog to SEAPA?
I think what led me to SEAPA was we're talking about all these different growing methods, right? 5 different growing methods. It was way too much. It was really complicated. I was spending a lot of time training staff, trying to retain staff, hiring staff. All these different growing methods required a very different set of principles and a lot of maintenance. And sometimes you vary gear because that's what you need to do as a farmer because of the site. That makes sense.
Right.
But other times you just look, I was getting frustrated. We had too much variety and we were too inefficient. And I think I'd seen SEAPA or maybe Hexel at a trade show. Maybe I saw some videos of the Australian method. And at Hog, we were spending an enormous amount of time building and repairing gear. And we are really trying to be much more responsible and more sustainable with our gear. And, I'm probably exaggerating the number a little bit, but I was buying tens of thousands of cable ties, zip ties on a semi-regular basis to build and repair gear. And so here I am, I'm managing the farm. And at this point, I'm actually a director of farm operations. We started another farm with Hog Island, but I'll get into that later. But I'm paying staff to put cable ties on. I'm paying staff to cut them off so that they can open the bags or repair the gear. And then I was paying staff to clean them up because we didn't want it just to become trash. And I was just like, this is just silly. And seeing the Australian gear, the SEAPA and Hexel, these great baskets, they had doors that opened and closed. And that was a big part of why we were using cable ties. It was to secure the closures. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant. Like, just by the fact that there was a design that had a door that opened and closed, I was like, I've just eliminated so many moves.
Yeah. Reduced your cost because now you don't need to buy all those zip ties either, right?
Yeah, exactly. Reduce cost. The more I started to learn about the SEAPA and its baskets, they're really durable. I mean, we were replacing bags, I would guess, maybe every 3 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there are baskets out there that are still working 20 years later.
That's a return on investment right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. As I travel around the oyster world, going to different farms, meeting different people, I hear a lot of reference to SEAPA and other ones too. So tell me what SEAPA is and who you are in the industry.
Sure. So SEAPA is based out of Adelaide, Australia. And they've been making baskets 25 years, maybe a couple more. And it started with the owner and founder, Gary, who, as the story goes, he saw a news article on TV about oyster farmers and how they were growing oysters and having difficulty, and thought that he could probably come up with a better container for them to use. Gary was in the plastics business, plastic injection mold specifically, and he basically started knocking on doors with oyster farmers and started talking to them about his ideas and what they were looking for and what they needed. And I think 90% of the oyster farmers just told Gary to get lost. Like, I know what I'm doing. It works
Right.
fine. Get out of here. I have work to do. But he found an oyster farmer who had an open mind, and they started to develop the first SEAPA basket, 15-liter basket. And there may have been another basket company out there. I don't think so. I mean, SEAPA is one of the first. I'll put it that way.
Describe a typical SEAPA basket to me.
Yeah, so about 2.5 feet long, probably around a 10 to 14 inch diameter, kind of oval in shape. So a little bit of a flat bottom with curved sides, and then two clips that would attach it to a line.
And it's rigid plastic, so it retains
Yeah, rigid.
oval shape the whole time.
Exactly. Rigid injection molded plastic, super UV resistant, super tough. I mentioned the doors earlier, and they come flat packed. They come in boxes. You have to kind of assemble them, which can be a pain in the butt, honestly, to begin with. But you get the hang of it pretty quick.
How many oysters typically in a basket? But I suppose that depends upon the size of the holes and the size of the oysters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. SEAPA makes a few different mesh sizes, 3, 6, 12, 20, and then we have some spat sock inserts, and those inserts have a 1 and 1.6 mil
Right.
sock. The general recommendation is your oysters are twice the size of your mesh. The really easy way, and I wish I'd listened to SEAPA more back when I was farming oysters, was that idea of you fill the baskets at a quarter of the way. Once they reach half, you split the densities. The reason I like that is it gets rid of a lot of the math. As a crew member or just trying to streamline operations, we spent a lot of time at Hog Island counting oysters, figuring out our density counts. Multiple, okay, how many oysters per liter? How many liters per container? Oh, we need to do 1.2 liters, or no. Fill it at a quarter, split it at a half. Let's go.
So the idea behind the whole SEAPA basket is to create an environment where the oysters are floating in the water column and moving with the tides.
Yeah, absolutely. So SEAPA's main focus to begin with was what we call the adjustable longline system. So the baskets would hang from a line that was off bottom, probably waist level to chest high, working height. And that line could be raised or lowered on the posts depending on what you needed to do to grow your oysters. So if it was really young oysters and you needed to really promote fast growth rates, you might have the line really low so that the oysters are lower in the water column, feeding more, growing more rapidly. As oysters mature and you need to harden up the shell, you're probably raising that line to get them to tumble and have more wind and wave action and desiccate. That's the other big thing. And I think a lot of people don't realize this, oyster eaters, that is. It actually really improves the condition and the shape and the meat quality of the oysters when they're intertidal. To be exposed to air for a little bit is really great. It helps strengthen that abductor muscle so that they travel better to the market. So by raising and lowering that line, as a grower, you could really manipulate the growing conditions of those oysters very quickly.
So I could adjust the lines so that at high tide, the baskets are beneath the surface of the water, and then when the tide drops down, they're hanging above the water in open air, desiccating, basically.
Exactly.
Keeping the oysters far enough away from the bottom so that they're not easy prey for some of the predators like the green crabs or the rays that you mentioned is a better advantage for the oysters overall as you're growing them, right?
I think so. Yeah, you'll find the growth rates much faster off bottom. The other thing that happens when you grow oysters on bottom is you're either going to be in mud, which means you probably don't have that much current and potentially your oysters are sinking in the mud. And oysters are filter feeders. They need to be filtering water. They're not clams, right? And if you've got a sandy bottom, Well, sand typically to me means that there's a lot of current, there's a lot of movement. That means
Mm.
that your oysters on the bottom can get buried because the sand ends up moving on top of them. So yeah, I mean, there's methods to prevent that, but it's much easier, I think, just to get off bottom. You have a lot more access to water and food.
And I understand it's the wave action that really helps promote growth of the shell.
Yeah, that wind and wave energy, that kind of pruning that leading edge of growth, which is one of the reasons why I think you see a lot of farmers going to more floating culture so that they're capturing more energy. The oysters are tumbling more.
Well, now SEAPA has a floating basket kind of arrangement now too. I think it's called the Revo that you recently
Yeah,
launched.
yeah.
Tell me a little.
SEAPA saw people using floats, understood the idea behind capturing that wind and wave energy to get a better shaped oyster, and also the idea of using a floating method potentially to rotate the oysters out of the water so that you could dry them. And that was one of the big tricks.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Flip Farm came out, and I think they've done a really good job with some stuff. And in some ways, maybe they beat SEPA to the punch a little bit, but we had been working on it for a while, and we were able to develop this system with our baskets that it allows a farmer to rotate his baskets in and out of the water, but you can take that basket off the float. So as a farmer, if I have different growing areas where intertidal is appropriate in one place and floating is more appropriate in another place, I could take that same basket off the Revo system and go put it on an intertidal line, or vice versa, as needed. Because I can take that basket off, that also means that I can switch out the basket for if the basket needs repair, if I need a different
Mm-hmm.
size mesh. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
locked into a line that has all one size mesh, or I can only use this line for X. The idea behind it was that it was adaptable for whatever
Yeah.
the grower needed. So if you want to do that processing and harvesting and all that stuff out on the water, you can. But if that's not what your operation is set up for, you don't have to do it that way. You can manipulate it and adapt it to what suits you.
The adaptability is interesting. There are some farmers who like to grow oysters in different techniques during the lifespan of that particular oyster. They'll have it intertidal for a period of time, then they'll have it hanging, then they'll have it floating on the surface. And it sounds like SEPA is designed for that sort of flexibility.
Yeah, we put a lot of thought into the adaptability and the flexibility. And we have basically 3 lines right now. And all those baskets can be used intertidally. They can be used subtidally, like in a stack or a brick of
Right.
baskets. They can be used in floating methods. Our clip system and the end caps that kind of help determine some of the shape of the basket, those are all adaptable to different methods. SEAPA is a global company. People are growing oysters differently all over the world and have different conditions or different traditions.
How does the growing techniques differ in different places around the world? For example, China, Japan, Australia, obviously. Are there big differences in the way they do things and the gear that's needed?
Yeah, there's some differences, although there are common themes around the world. Traditionally in Japan, for instance, I was able to go there a couple of years ago to give some presentations and meet with Japanese oyster farmers. And the Pacific oyster, which is the most abundant oyster grown around the world, originally comes from Japan. You go to the majority, probably 95, 98% of the farms in Japan, they're using technology that I think is ancient, but it's very traditional. They are using long lines of scallop shells attached to a wire and hanging those scallop shells from rafts. So they're growing what I call cluster oysters. They're just growing these big clumps of oysters underneath rafts. And that's the predominant method. And so the single seed method to Japan is very new. Within, I'm guessing, the last decade, last 15 years, The stories that I've heard, the oyster farming industry was already struggling in Japan a little bit. So you have a struggling industry, earthquake hits, tsunami hits, severely decimates the industry. And they wanted to rebuild. Well, you had a few pioneering oyster farmers that were like, well, if we're going to rebuild something, why are we going to rebuild something that wasn't working? Let's take examples from what is working. And they connected with SEAPA. And SEAPA helped arrange a bunch of tours and this cross cultural exchange. And Japan is now getting into the single seed market and is one of SEAPA's better markets right now. It's definitely interesting to see them coming along. There are starting to be oyster bars and the half shell market in Japan. I don't know how extensive it is, but it's growing. So I've been able to visit farmers in Japan, in Australia. I just got back from a trip to Portugal and saw some farms there. I haven't made it to France yet, but what is amazing is these plays on the different methods of growing oysters. Like I said, that there are some common themes. The rack and bag method has definitely gone all over the world. People, the what I call the tipping bags, these bags that are in intertidal situations but have a float attached to them so that the oysters are tumbling. That's a trend that's definitely catching on all over the world, where one end of the bag is clipped to a line that stays still. At the other end of the bag, there's a float. So as the tide comes in, that bag raises and then lowers with the tide. And when it's caught into the water column, it's also capturing that wind and wave energy. So the oysters are tumbling. You get a really nice deep cupped oyster out of that. And as far as I know, it was Chelsea Farms up in Washington State that developed that. John Lentz. You know, I mentioned earlier that there are SEAPA baskets that are out there that are over 20 years old. You know, when I think about the amount of gear that farmers go through buying and replacing, and then the labor to do all that, I'm kind of flabbergasted, actually. I'm like, how can you still be doing this? I just don't get it sometimes. And they're good friends.
What kind of market share is SEAPA? Is SEAPA kind of the biggest of the sort of floating gear right now?
I definitely think that SEAPA has a pretty healthy market share of the global gear demand.
Right.
But there are a lot of different gear manufacturers out there. And there's a lot of very creative farmers who have a lot of Frankenstein gear out there. And I'm still amazed by farmers trying to reinvent the wheel. You know, I'm just like, guys, you know, like we've put all this thought into it, like stick with the methods. I mean, yes, of course you can adapt, but you don't need to reinvent the whole wheel.
Are there opportunities to develop oysters and aquaculture in underutilized areas like in Africa, Southeast Asia, India? What kind of opportunities are out there for expanding oyster aquaculture around the world?
I think the opportunities are growing. I've heard about farms in Senegal, and there's a handful of countries that are experimenting with oyster farming in Africa. I think there actually is some established oyster farming and oyster culture going on in South America. I just don't think it's nearly at the level that it is in the Northern Hemisphere or in Western.
Well, you know, I've often wondered about oysters in places like Southeast Asia where it tends to be very hot, water temperatures are pretty high, but it's like that in the Gulf of Mexico at times. So I find it curious that there don't appear to be oyster operations in some of those areas.
I do know, like, we're starting to talk with oyster farmers in Vietnam, in Taiwan, in Korea. So I think there are oyster farming operations out there. I just think that for whatever reason, they've been a little bit under the radar.
I hear a lot of people talking about scalability with oyster production and technology that enables one to produce huge scale of oysters. Does SEAPA get involved in that kind of global scale production of oysters? Is that something you guys are focusing on?
It's definitely something that we're paying attention to and we discuss. Absolutely. What's happening with oyster culture around the world is that the nearshore operations are getting pushed out because of homeowners, water quality. There's a variety of different reasons that are pushing the oyster farmers further and further away. On the one hand, it's exciting. On the other hand, it's kind of a shame because it's not like they're getting pushed out for good reasons. It's the development, it's the water quality, it's these conflicting uses. And it's really a shame that the oyster farmers are the ones basically that are taking the brunt of it feels like sometimes, and getting shoved aside. I think that's part of the reason why SEAPA pursued Revo it was again trying to find a system that allowed an oyster farmer to grow oysters in different water that he may have been able to grow oysters in before. And yeah, we're definitely looking at and exploring and developing ideas around deep water and further offshore.
Do you think that oysters realistically can be grown globally on such a scale that it can become almost like a keystone protein to help feed the world? What's your thought on that?
I'm hopeful, but I'm skeptical. I mean, yeah, it could probably get there, but it's going to take a huge amount of investment, and there's going to be a lot of failures in trying to achieve those kind of scales. And to be able to do that on a much bigger scale would be incredible. But there's a lot of things that have to change. The market has to change. People's eating habits have to change. And quite honestly, the proliferation of farmers that we have and the money that they're getting for their oysters would have to change drastically, right? So if you're producing that kind of large scale oyster operation that's just, feeding the world, you're not getting $4 for an oyster at the oyster bar.
Right.
Those two things don't go together.
Yeah, I think about large-scale land farming, and you have these huge corporate conglomerates that are producing massive quantities of food and shipping them around the world and that sort of thing. Is there opportunity for big corporate to get involved in oyster aquaculture?
I think there is. Some of the oyster companies in Australia are publicly traded. And I think that they're engaged in more than just oyster farming. But yeah, there's been a lot of consolidation in the Australian market and money coming into that. Yeah, I want to know more about that.
Now, China, I read, actually has the largest production of oysters in the world.
I would believe it.
Do they keep to themselves in terms of the technology and gear that they use, or is China a big market for a company like SEAPA?
Well, I'm going to have to be careful about we we actively do not sell in China on purpose.
Interesting.
We are worried about copyright infringement and our gear getting copied and sold, and that's something I see happening more and more, that the leaders in technology in the oyster industry, yeah, I see cheap alternatives, copycats coming out with no recourse. But you know what? I'm a little bit bummed at some of the farmers. Again, I know a lot of these guys. And I get that they have their bills to pay and they have businesses to run and it's all very hard decisions. But I'm just like, to hear them whining about some of those behaviors on the one hand, and then to see them turn around and buy that gear, support that. I'm just like, come on, guys.
So what do you think is the future technology for oyster aquaculture?
I think there's a couple different things that are going to develop. Again, I think oyster production is going to have to continue to look at going further offshore and going deeper. So that's going to happen. And I think there's some outfits out there that are already starting to explore that. But for the oyster culture that I know and love, your information technology, I think you're going to see more and more collaboration between researchers and farmers and capturing data, like what is going on with water chemistry, what's time and temperature, pollutants, and being able to track an oyster from the hatchery all the way to the market in a really simple and affordable way for the farmer and for the gear producer. So I think that's one of the things that gear producers might look at is how they can fit into that, working in collaboration with AI so that a farmer can say, okay, if I plant oyster B in March in this area of the bay, I know with this much certainty that I'm probably going to get this product at that time. I think farmers are going to start to have that kind of data and that analysis available to them much easier. But that's going to have to be automated, because if it's just the farmer out there putting bullshit into the data collection device, you know the saying, it's bullshit in, bullshit out. So how that data is collected is going to have to change and become a little less expensive. I remember being at Hog, and we'd gotten a drone so that we could do more aerial shots and monitor our gear more. And at one point we were talking about, oh, well, it'd be easy enough to have somebody write a program so that when that drone flies over our beds, it can recognize if a space has an oyster bag in it or it does not, and we can take our inventory that way. All those little things.
It makes total sense. It's just understanding how you can apply the new technologies that are emerging.
Yeah.
So do you eat a lot of oysters?
Oh, absolutely. Not as many as I used to when I was a farmer. Oysters are expensive.
I was recently in Bermuda at this restaurant, and I saw on their menu they had a medley of oysters from PEI down the East Coast to the West Coast, and it was $94 for a dozen.
Oh, my goodness.
Realize there's some shipping costs, but it's like, I don't know how you can justify that.
Well, what's great is that you are able to find those oysters in Bermuda. I mean, that's the neat thing, that cold chain technology that's come out. That's one of those things that has allowed the oyster industry to expand and get to markets that they weren't able to get to before.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Erik, this has been fascinating talking to you and learning about what your background is and what SEAPA's doing. So thank you very much for being my guest.
Yeah, of course, Kevin. Thank you so much. It was really a joy to be able to speak with you. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Oyster-ology. From grow-out bags to oysters around the world, we've seen how design and innovation shape not just the farmer's work, but the oysters on your plate. Thanks so much to my guest, Erik Schlagenhauf of SEAPA. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, share it with a friend, and leave a review so more people can discover it too. Thanks for listening, and please be sure to join me again next time as I pry open the shell of another interesting oysterology topic.